So in the real world, we have different races, different culture. Well, race is a bad term, but we have different ethnicities and different cultures spread across the world that exist in their physical configurations, whatever that is, skin tone, eye color, variation in skin tone and hair and all of that, based on specific historical and evolutionary biological development. So in our world, they exist in certain patterns in certain places based on initially evolution and dispersal of early man, and then later on based on colonization and the like. Now, that said, that doesn't have to be that way in a fantasy setting. So what I'd like to talk about today, and I certainly want to thank you for coming back to Elfpate to check it out, but I wanted to talk about dispersing your various peoples in your fantasy realms. So there's a really easy trap to fall into when you are creating a fantasy setting, to try to place people based on real world models. And by people in this particular instance, I'm going to stick to specifically humans, because for the most part, the elves and dwarves and all of that are more often delineated by geology or geography, wherever they happen to, topography, whatever ographies, and ologies that they're going to be dispersed by. Wood elf, rock gnome, mountain dwarf. But humans, when you're creating a world for D&D, it's easy to fall into those same world patterns like we have today. Now, it's not wrong, and certainly if you want to have a very believable, gritty world, it stands to reason that you're going to have this development. But when you're creating a fantasy world, there are some things to look at that kind of give you a much more of a carte blanche as far as how to disperse your races or your peoples. Race is a very outmoded term. I use it not in any derogatory sense, but just because it sticks with me. It's old hat and it's there. I try not to use it, but so ethnicities, cultures, I'll try and stick to that. So first of all, in fantasy settings, we often have people who are created by their deities. It's not a postulation, it's not a myth, it's not a theory. It is the literal truth that some deity or pantheon of deities created a people and placed them where they are. Now, that being the case, you can easily explain a very random division of humans, or any species for that matter, any species of intelligent life in your D&D setting, because the deities may have plopped your Greco-Roman folks right next to your samurai folks. And in a fantasy setting, while it might be jarring to the more history-minded folks or anthropological brains in your adventuring group, it's not out of whack for fantasy. I mean, we often mirror real-world divisions of ethnicities and cultures. The second thing to consider, besides just the fact that there is a very definite creationist bent to fantasy, is that fantasy worlds are often old, and whatever fantasy world you're playing in is generally the result of several ages that have unfolded. In Middle-earth, that is Middle-earth because there was a previous Earth, and there is, we're living in the Earth after that. So it is very likely and possible that in previous ages, similar looking people may have dispersed out into the world and then subsequently been divided or cut off. And you might find, just to use an example, a light-skinned Germanic European, like European stock like myself, you might find them in the south and also in the north, but between them might be darker skin toned, differently skin toned, differently cultured people. And those two Germanic looking cultures may have zero in common culturally, because maybe the northern culture has been there since the first age, and the ones in the south, they came there in the second age, having left from some other place in the world, and now have developed into their current culture in the third age. Whatever your age system is. It could be that these two, north and south, were part of one overall empire, and an incursion from the east to the west by some other form of humanity cut them in half, and they've developed very differently culturally. Perhaps the ones in the north are still very grounded to the earth and totemic, and that's they're a good source for barbarian characters. Whereas your Germanic folk in the south, they have found different gods. Maybe they're monotheistic. Maybe they follow something similar to the Norse gods. Maybe they're culturally different. They may look like me, but maybe they live in a very honor-bound warrior society that, for all intents and purposes, is much more akin to, say, feudal Japan than medieval Europe. So again, different ages can create very differently divided and arrayed humanity. The third thing to consider is that in your fantasy setting, you also have very powerful beings and forces in play in the real, in the now, in the near times to your game. So again, when I was mentioning before, first age, second age, third age, nothing's to say that a group of light-skinned European folk couldn't have been uplifted by some aboleth, or enslaved by mind flayers and deposited on an island somewhere. Maybe in the far-off tropical setting of the world, where you wouldn't expect to find fair-skinned, fair-haired folk. There is a bustling culture based on the fact that some pirate crew or some colonial fleet or a treasure fleet or something in the second age was blown far off course and had no choice but to settle in this island, not knowing where they were, having lost their navigation. Maybe there's some magical storm or something. And, that's the other thing, too, is while in the real world, skin color and hair color is very much tied to environment and developed over millions of years, it's not so much to say, there's nothing to say that a god who is dark-skinned, light-skinned, purple-skinned human, whatever color your human being you're developing is, didn't just say, my guys live here. Yeah, it's cold, but they're brown. They're brown-skinned, or they're tan-skinned, or they're albinos, whatever the case may be. So don't get hung up on real-world mix of culture, color, ethnicity, and stuff like that. You can easily excuse the fact that, while your players have been adventuring primarily in a European type setting, you really, really feel the need to get some Persian flavor in there, but you don't want to have them have to travel all the way to your world's version of the Middle East to run into them. Maybe there's a little Persian style kingdom with Persian looking people, and of course I'm grossly generalizing here, but for the sake of this discussion, we're going to simplify things. I get that there's no one way that a Persian looks, and there's no one way that a European looks, or an African looks, or an Asian looks, or anything like that. That is just for the sake of this argument. We're going to have very specific, not even an argument, discussion, very specific breakdowns to help with the dialogue. It's not it's not to simplify or marginalize. It's just to basically for clarity. So remember that when you're making these worlds, it doesn't have to fit like the real world. It can very much be a hodgepodge, a random assortment, a creationist tapestry that is specific to your universe, and it allows you to have a much greater mix of cultures when you're playing your game. Anyway, this is Eli with Elfbait again. Thanks for checking us out. Like, share, and subscribe. Comment below. You can get a hold of me at baittheelf@gmail.com, Elfbait on Facebook, and the Elfbait, or an Elfbait on Twitter. There's an Elfbait group on Facebook, but I'm also Elfbait on Twitter. Love to hear from folks, so reach out, ask me questions, suggest episodes, tell me how you like to build your worlds. The place to do that is down below in the comments, and I'll be getting some more videos out later this week. Have a good one.